How did I learn all this? Experimentation, a little bit of reading, and like, not very many video tutorials. If you guys don't know, I guess it's been a little while since I talked about this on stream, but when I started doing makeup, I still was on that copium. I still thought I was like a cis dude when I started doing makeup. And I was just sort of experimenting with it in a way that, in retrospect, it's very egg-like. But I was still repressing all of that, so I was just like, guys can wear makeup, it's fine. I'm just like a femboy, you know? I'm just gonna be like a femboy type. But I think I knew deep down that if I sought out video tutorials and got like really, really knowledgeable about makeup, I think I knew that it would crack my egg, even though I didn't know what that even meant at the time. So I just like avoided it, because that was just part of my own internal repression, was just like, you know, rejecting anything that would give me even vaguely trans feelings. Because, as I've stated, like, I desperately, at a point in time, because of like internalized trans misogyny and everything, I desperately didn't want to be trans. Which is really sad. Like, but understandable, you know, because, like, obviously, trans people get a bad shake in our society, but me denying the reality wasn't gonna help me, you know? Like, I was trans already, I just was lying to myself, basically. Yeah, I should tell okay. I will tell this again, since it's been a while since I told this story on stream. But basically, a few years ago, it was maybe 2018, 2019, I got really sort of into like lucid dreaming, learning how to lucid dream. I was on subreddits, I was on forums, I was writing dream journals, I was doing dream checks or reality checks and shit. All explicitly knowing in my mind that the reason, Tofu, thank you for that gift tea, by the way. Knowing deep down that the reason I was learning to do this, to lucid dream, it took me probably 6 months or so to finally successfully do it, which I did. Twice. I was successfully able to like take control in a dream and do just whatever kind of I wanted. And both times, the first thing I did, knowing full well that this was always the reason I was learning to do it, the first thing I did was look into like a mirror and see myself as a girl. And that was always the reason I was learning to lucid dream, was to see myself as a girl in my dreams, was to be a woman in my dreams. My eggshell didn't crack for about another 2 years after that. I repressed and continued to tell myself that I was cis for several more years after that. Yeah. It's kind of wild. But hey, we're on the other side of it now. What finally did crack it? Okay, I'll go into that too. This is something like, I've told all these stories a few times on the broadcast before, but I feel like I should continuously keep retelling them because, you know, we're consistently cycling through viewers and also gaining new viewers just all the time. You know, this community continues to grow, so I probably could stand to just retell these stories about once every 1 to 2 months. But what cracked my eggshell ultimately wasn't even really realizing that I was trans. Because even then, I was still, like, resistant. You know, there were still some mental blocks getting in the way. The thing that really cracked my, like, rock hard, my fucking eggshell made of stone was just acknowledging that I wasn't cis. So basically, like, what actually, like, started forming the cracks was I had a fairly close friend at the time come out to me as trans. I was, like, one of the first people that she told. And I had sort of already been tossing around the idea that I was non-binary in my head. Just because I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. Like, I cannot keep telling myself that I am cis when I am obviously not. So I was just like, you know what? That was the first person I told. I think I had probably acknowledged several weeks before that point, but she was the first person that I told I was non-binary. That was back in, like, February-ish of 2021. And then from there, it was basically just like a slip and slide down the pronoun pipeline. Because acknowledging that I wasn't cis, and acknowledging that, like, I wanted to, and it's okay for me to experiment with how I'm presenting, and, like, who I am. Just sort of, like, entering that stage of, like, completely reconstructing, or, like, finally constructing my truest sort of self for the first time ever. I basically was just, you know, testing the waters of how femme I wanted to present, and I just never found a point where I wanted to stop. You know, I was like, no, more femme. It's not femme enough. Until basically right around maybe October or November. I was already on HRT by that point. I started HRT in June. Yeah, and I started HRT kind of to become a more effective, like, femboy. Kind of. But by like October or November, I started to, like, acknowledge that I was probably trans. I couldn't tell you an exact date for any of this stuff because it just kind of happened spontaneously, or even not even spontaneously. It was just kind of a gradual process. It was such a gradual process for me. And a lot of that really for me just like, how gradual the process was really came from just, like, the process of stripping back years of repression. I was still kind of on cis cope on HRT. I was like, femboy coping still. So yeah, I'm not gonna talk about, like, my process of getting HRT, by the way. But yeah, like, really, when it comes to, like, early childhood trans experiences, I don't have as many as a lot of other people do. There are a lot of trans people who, you know, for one reason or another weren't quite as openly hostile to their own sort of inner transness. I think a lot of that just comes from how I was socialized, where I grew up. A lot of things led to that sort of repression. So, like, to whatever extent there were early childhood experiences of, like, you know, oh, I knew I was trans when I was 6 or whatever, like, I can't say any of that, which is kind of alienating at times as a trans woman. Because you'll have people say, like, oh, I knew I was trans for sure at a very young age. And for me, it's like, I don't know if I did. I didn't even know what being trans was. Or, like, you know, and to whatever extent after the fact that I could look back on, like, my brain kind of dumped a lot of those memories. Like, there's a lot of trauma involved with being, like, a repressed trans person without, like, kind of knowing it. And I think just because of, like, how sort of confusing of an experience that can be to, like, be trans but not know what being trans is or what that means or what that feels like, like, my brain just tossed a lot of those memories because they didn't make me feel good, you know? Those memories were not something that throughout my life, further on, I wanted to reinforce, so I never recalled any of it. I always just preferred to forget. So, like, my memories from my early childhood up through adolescence are very, very weak. Like, I don't have super vivid memories of, like, a lot of time in my childhood. So I couldn't even tell you. Like, there are some moments, right? There are some things, some, like, character traits, some behaviors that I can look back on and be like, that seems egg-like, right? But there's no way for me to say, oh, I knew, or, like, you know, for sure, you can look back at this moment in my life or that moment, and, like, you would know that I was trans even at an early age. I don't have that. I don't have that. So yeah, if any of you are, like, in a similar boat to me, I just want you guys to know that, like, just because you kind of feel like maybe your life story doesn't quite as neatly fit into, like, a convenient, sort of easy to process narrative from point A to point B, or, like, something that you could easily explain to someone and be like, here's why trans people are valid because, you know, trans kids know that they're trans. If you don't fit into that, that's still okay. And I want to, like, you know, that's why I share these stories, is to sort of provide you guys with some solidarity, maybe a role model, something, anything, to let you know that, like, you're not alone. You know, growing up in, like, middle America is not exactly, like, a friendly environment for trans people, especially, you know, growing up in, like, the early 2000s like I did. So, like, you know, things get a little messy when you're in an environment that's, like, openly hostile to your very existence. And so if your experience deviates even fairly wildly from the typical or, like, the norm, or what you might feel like the norm is, even if that's not even necessarily the case, like, that's okay. You're still valid, you know? You're still, like, you're every bit as real of a trans person. If you didn't realize you were trans until, you know, your 20s or 30s or even further beyond, if you didn't realize it until then, you're still every bit as valid as someone who knew they were trans at, like, age 8. You know? That doesn't change who you are, ultimately. Like, everybody kind of has their own baggage, their own trauma, their own journeys to go through. Everybody has their own sort of unique geographical, social, familial, community circumstances that might cause things to differ fairly wildly. But that's okay. Like, I didn't realize I was full on, like, trans until I was 24. And, like, I think the earliest memory I have where I, like, should have known I was trans, I was, like, 18. So I repressed for, like, 6 years fairly heavily, and was repressing for a long time even before that, but that's when I was actively repressing, not just passively. But, you know, like I've said as well, there are times where I feel like, oh, if only I could go back in time 2 years, 3 years, and just, like, shake my little egg self and be like, what the fuck are you doing, you moron? You know? Like, you're trans, you idiot, you dingus. Like, I don't even know if I would have been ready for that at the time. I don't know if I would have been able to process that and take action on that information at the time. You know? Because, frankly, there kind of was already a little voice in the back of my head that was telling me that at several points. You know, I had those little moments of, like, well, maybe I'm trans, you know? Like, I watched a lot of, like, ContraPoints and shit, and, like, I watched a lot of stuff from, like, trans content creators, and there were a lot of moments where, you know, in the back of my head, you know, my psyche was like, hey, maybe you're trans, and I was just like, nope, not true, false. Gonna bottle that right back up. Yeah, maybe it is my future self whispering in my ear, but I wasn't ready for it at the time, so I just kept pushing it down. But that's okay. Like, I think subconsciously, I was always sort of still working towards getting myself into the position where eventually I could get to a point where I could accept that. Ultimately, I was like taking steps to get where I was going anyway. Maybe I should just go like whole hog on the feels today. Just like go through all the old stories. I haven't mentioned in a while, but there was like a point in time during that like active repression phase between the ages of like, I don't know, 18 to like 23, 24-ish, where I was like, I thought I was a chaser. Like, literally. Because I had, like, a sort of, let's just say, a special fascination with trans women. And it took me a little while to realize that the reason I was fascinated with trans women, well, one, yes, I'm physically attracted to them. I think they're hot. That hasn't changed. That's still, if anything, I feel that stronger now than I did then. The reason, though, that I had that special fascination wasn't just, like, sexual attraction, it was also gender envy. And I just didn't know it. And it took me a while to realize that. Being a chaser kind of broke my... Well, really, I think they reinforce each other. It's not that being a chaser cracked my eggshell, it's that being a chaser was a symptom of me repressing my own transness. Because, and one of the things I can look back to now, I've talked about this a few times, one of the things I can look back to now as like a, well, that's not exactly cisgendered chaser behavior, was the fact that I would like occasionally load up r/trans timelines and like cry, looking at like some of those timelines and like how happy being trans made some people. I would literally like, you know, lie awake at night crying at r/trans timelines. That's not normal chaser behavior. That's not like fetishist chaser behavior. That is very much repressed transgender behavior. And that was at a time where like I rarely would ever cry because I was like socialized as a Midwestern guy. And like that is an environment where you are encouraged to repress everything, to bottle everything up. Yes, Emma, I did the exact same thing. I just convinced myself that it wasn't possible for me, that it wasn't right for me, that it couldn't be me. Couldn't be me, because all these reasons, you know? Couldn't be me because, like, my family wouldn't be supportive. Couldn't be me because I live in a part of the country where trans people aren't treated well. Couldn't be me because how am I going to get access to hormones? Couldn't be me for yada, 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 this, that, and the other thing. That didn't ever, none of that ever changed the reality. It was all cope. Because none of that changes, ultimately, the fundamental facts of, like, who I am. Just because I had a difficult social situation for transitioning doesn't change the fact that I'm trans. Just because I live in a part of the country that isn't always nice and is oftentimes openly hostile to trans people doesn't change the fact that I was trans. Just because I didn't have, like, an easy and visible pathway to, like, getting hormones in a way that, like, was comfortable for me did not change the reality that I was trans, no matter how much I wished it could at that point, because I was repressing, right? So like, you know, I was sort of misguided. That's why I say that, you know, I wish that I could have not been trans because I was repressing it. But ultimately, there's no amount of repression that will end up being healthy for you. You either acknowledge the reality, or you sort of continue scrambling. You continue sort of floundering, flopping about, just a confused little egg, like a fish out of water, just flopping around, trying to do whatever you can to feel like you fit in the world that you live in. When ultimately, the thing that will put you back in the water is being yourself, you know, being the person that you're afraid to be. Because that's ultimately like a lot of what drove my repression, right? Was just fear, anxiety, and those are like perfectly valid feelings to have. Sometimes being trans is kinda scary, especially when you're around like, you know, hostile people. Sometimes you feel anxious, finally like coming to terms with like a fundamental reality that you've been repressing your entire life. Staring that straight in the eyes when you've been repressing it for over 2 decades, that's not an easy thing to do, so I can't blame myself for being anxious and scared. That's like, in my mind, that's a logical sort of way to feel, or that's like, that makes sense considering that this was a fundamental reality of my very existence that I was actively bottling up for 20 years, basically. Like, of course I'm gonna be like nervous about confronting that. Especially when, at the time, I was basically alone. Like, I didn't have any queer friends, any support structure. Which is why, by the way, I'm just coming to the realization now, I didn't have any queer friends, I didn't have any support structure, anybody I felt like I could relate to in my life. So the first time one of my friends comes out to me as trans, I'm like, oh, thank God. And I immediately come out to someone for the first time in my life that very moment. It's all making sense. It's all coming together. Of course that would be the moment where I would finally, like, say it out loud for the first time. Is when I had a singular ally, one friend who I felt like I could relate to. So hey, that's just another fucking reason, you guys, to be proud and be like open and honest about who you are. Get out there, go like exist in the real world and like be some representation in your like community, in your friend groups, whatever, of like trans people just existing with normal human lives, because having that normalization, having an ally, having someone nearby that you feel like you can like trust and relate to and everything will literally help other people come to the conclusion that you found. And that's like literally, I've talked about this many times, one of the reasons I do what I do is like explicitly, I stream to crack people's eggshells. I do. I stream to give people representation. I stream to give people an example, a role model of like a trans person just existing, not always having everything be about specifically being trans, but just being a trans person on Twitch who like has fun with their community and like sharing my stories, sharing moments like this with people. Because ultimately I know that, like, what I'm doing here is essentially I'm just giving my community sort of the role model that I wish I would have had when I was, like, say, 18. Or maybe even younger. But, like, when I was younger and, you know, if somebody had just sort of, like, given me the right sort of shoulder to cry on, just the right time, or someone had just said the right words to me at, like, a specific point in my life to, like, help me come to that realization a little more peacefully. I'm just giving you guys that. I'm, like, telling you guys the stuff I wish I would have heard when I was 19. So, yeah. This was sweet. I'm gonna add a marker to the VOD here, so I can, like, maybe flip this out later, or highlight this out and, like, upload it to YouTube or something, maybe. Woo! No, yeah, don't worry. If you guys are, like, getting emotional at that, it has taken everything in my power to, like, you know, keep my emotions in control just enough that I could, like, talk concisely. Like, if I were to just, like, you know, uncork myself, I would just start weeping right now. But, like, you know, I got a point to make here. So I'm talking through it. But yeah, like, there you go. There's, like, a very serious, a very real moment of, like, trans solidarity, trans understanding, trans experience condensed for you guys.